Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to our daily Hindu analysis. Before we begin, we have a few exciting announcements. First, we are holding our National Scholarship Test on the 3rd of April, and this is a chance for IAS aspirants to win attractive scholarships to our courses. So, all those who are interested, kindly register by using the link provided in the description box below. Then, as promised, we are going to launch several new exciting initiatives from April. From tomorrow, we shall be launching a Prelims 2022 Hack series, which will help you remember important facts for your prelims through simple mnemonics, mind maps, and tricks. This shall be a weekly session conducted by Harshmeet sir, and the video will go live every Friday at 3 p.m. And this will be a limited series that will run until your prelims 2022. Then finally, for tomorrow's explained session, Abhishek sir will be taking a very important topic, which is the BBNJ Treaty or Biodiversity Beyond Natural Jurisdiction, which is being negotiated at the UN. And in this detailed discussion, we are going to cover the history of UN clause or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, under which the BBNJ Treaty is being negotiated. So don't miss this session, which goes live tomorrow at 8 p.m. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 8 of the daily edition. This column is written by Bisho Parajuli, who is the representative and country director to India for the UN World Food Programme. In this column, he examines the challenge of global hunger and how India's successful story in achieving food security and in providing food aid and food assistance to other countries can help the world to deal with the challenge of global hunger, along with providing a lesson for the developing world. See, global hunger is one of the most challenging social and governance issues that is affecting most developing and underdeveloped countries. This problem has been further aggravated as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the various conflicts that are going on around the world. For example, the conflict in Ukraine, the conflicts in West Asia, and the pandemic, they have disrupted the global supply chains, thereby resulting in food shortages and inflation. Upon this, the challenges to food production created by climate change and the general inequality in the world have all driven up the hunger crisis, and every year, millions are slipping into malnutrition. According to data from 2019, 650 million people in the world are suffering from chronic hunger, and this figure has jumped by 43 million as compared to data from 2014. Out of them, 270 million are staring at starvation, and this has doubled from the 135 million people who were on the brink of starvation in 2014. If this was the situation before the pandemic and before the Ukraine war, you can imagine what must be the situation today. Hunger and malnutrition are extremely punishing, especially to the weaker and vulnerable sections, and its primary impact is felt by children, women, old age people, and as well as by the differently abled. Such levels of chronic hunger and starvation pushes the weaker and vulnerable sections, such as young children, towards stunted growth and directly contributes to poor health indicators amongst the vulnerable classes. According to the writer, this is where India can step in and offer a solution to the world. Because India's story of food security is a success story, because a country which was suffering from chronic food shortage in 1960s rapidly transitioned into a food surplus country thanks to the policy and technological changes that it adopted during the Green Revolution. This helped India transform itself from a country that was dependent on food aid to a country that became self-sufficient within few years. But India's success story doesn't stop over here, as India has been delivering record food production in the last 3 decades and is a leading producer of most cereals and food grains. By making use of the food surplus, India has not only built up a buffer stock that guarantees food security to its own people, but it has also been delivering food aid and humanitarian food assistance to other countries in line with its philosophical belief and outlook of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. As India sees the whole world as one family, it has promoted the idea of a collective response to deal with all the global challenges. This idea was championed by none other than Prime Minister Modi himself in 2014 when he addressed the UN General Assembly. He listed out how India could lead and work with the world, especially the developing countries and underdeveloped countries, to deal with key global challenges, including climate change, environment protection, conflict management, and as well as food security. Because India has built a credible track record over the last 3 decades in delivering food security to its people, and even though it still deals with the problem of malnutrition, it has made considerable progress over the last 30 years. Thanks to well designed policies of the Government of India, such as the National Food Security Act of 2013, which was enacted by the Manmohan Singh government, right to food has been recognized as a legal right, and a food safety net has been put in place by improving the implementation of existing food security programs. Food security schemes, such as targeted public distribution, has delivered consistent food security to the poorer sections. Schemes like Midday Meal Program and ICDS have become integral to the nutritional security of children and pregnant women. This relative success of India has been possible because it has aligned its public procurement policies and buffer stock policies with its priorities and goals of establishing a food security net and achieving inclusive growth and development. A classic example for this would be the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, which was launched by the Modi government in 2020 after the pandemic broke out. To deal with the disruption caused by the pandemic and the lockdowns, this ambitious food security scheme was launched in addition to the existing food safety nets, and this scheme alone has delivered food security to around 800 million beneficiaries. Upon this, India has taken its success one step ahead and has delivered food aid and humanitarian food assistance to some of the countries which were facing a dire situation with regard to their hunger situation. For example, following the recent crisis in Afghanistan, India delivered massive quantities of food aid to the country. To deliver this food aid, India tied up with the World Food Programme, and last year it delivered 75,000 metric tons of food material to Afghanistan. This year again, especially after the Taliban took over, more than half the country's population was suffering from severe hunger, and India has recently delivered 50,000 metric tons of food grains via Pakistan. After Pakistan granted transit access to India's food aid, trucks have been carrying food material from India from the Wagah-Atari border via Pakistani territory, and they have been delivering it into the hands of the World Food Programme, which runs a massive food security network in Afghanistan. On similar lines, India has also been involved with the World Food Programme to deliver food aid and assistance to many conflict-hit countries and other starvation-hit countries in Africa and West Asia. For example, in Yemen and in Zimbabwe, where a civil war and an economic crisis, respectively, has aggravated the hunger crisis, India stepped in time with the World Food Programme to deliver emergency food aid and assistance. It is this strategy of India that could become a lesson for the developing world. Other developing countries and nations can draw a lesson from India's experience in not just ensuring their own food security, but also taking part in the global collective effort to tackle the problem of global hunger and achieve the Sustainable Development Goal target of zero hunger by 2030. This success of India is attributed to its successful policy and technological innovations in the agriculture sector, plus meaningful partnerships with key institutions such as the World Food Programme, and its intention and philosophy to help the world as its own community by delivering humanitarian food assistance. It is these principles and strategies of India which has provided success to India in food security, and it could offer key lessons to other countries, especially developing nations in the world. Now, this partnership between India and other countries and institutions can be critical for global peace and security because studies have clearly established a direct link between food security and peace and social cohesion. Achieving food security has been a proven solution to end several conflicts and to stabilize the political and social situation in several countries. It's because of this reason that the World Food Programme was honored with the Nobel Peace Prize back in 2020. It was a clear recognition of the link between food security and prevention of wars and conflicts. And in this regard, the World Food Programme has done a phenomenal job of addressing and solving the global hunger problem. So, in conclusion, India's philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and its success story in dealing with hunger can become a viable solution to this critical challenge that is facing the world. Now, let's look at this editorial from page number 8, which deals with a major development in West Asian geopolitics. See, just a few days back, Israel hosted a conference with the top diplomats and officials of United States and few Arab countries such as Bahrain, Morocco, and Egypt. The foreign ministers of these countries and their respective diplomats met in Israel for a high-profile meeting to take forward the economic and strategic partnership between them. This meeting represents a transformational shift or a paradigm shift in West Asian geopolitics. To understand why, we need to take a look at the Israel-Palestine issue. See, after Israel violated the two-state solution that was proposed by the UN, and after it declared unilateral independence in 1948, Israel snatched away the right of Palestinians to form their own country. Ever since, the Arab countries, including the Gulf countries, have come to the support and assistance of Palestinians, and the Arab states have even fought two major wars against Israel with the objective of liberating Palestine. As a result, Arab countries have always shared a hostile relationship with Israel, and they even went to the extent of not recognizing Israel, and most Arab countries did not even have diplomatic ties with Israel. Especially after the Arab states lost the 1948 war with Israel, they collectively decided to not recognize Israel and they decided not to have diplomatic relations with the country. But the Six-Day War of 1967 changed this, because again Israel not only defeated the Arab states, but also occupied the territories of key countries such as Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. During the war, Israel occupied the Sinai Peninsula or the Sinai Desert of Egypt, along with the Golan Heights of Syria. So this gave a leverage for Israel against Egypt, and eventually through negotiations that were mediated by the US, the Camp David Accords were signed in 1979, through which Israel agreed to return the Sinai Desert back to Egypt, and in return Egypt agreed to end its hostilities with Israel and not only recognize the country but also established peaceful diplomatic relations with the country. This was followed by Jordan recognizing Israel, and for a long period, these were the only two Arab countries which had relations with Israel. Then through the 1970s and 1980s, strategic and economic relations between US and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries started growing, and in return for seamless flow of Gulf oil, the US guaranteed the security of the monarchies in the Gulf region, and this essentially made Saudi Arabia and the Gulf nations close allies of the US. This enabled the US to mediate between the Gulf countries and Israel, and even though this Sunni power bloc, led by Saudi Arabia and UAE, couldn't officially abandon the Palestinian issue, and even though they couldn't officially recognize Israel, they ended up building secret relations with Israel with the help of US. And since many years, these countries, that is US, the Gulf nations led by Saudi Arabia, and Israel have been actively collaborating against their common arch enemy, that is Iran, which leads the Shia power bloc in West Asia. So it was not just the oil for security deal which brought US, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel together, but their intense rivalry and hostility with Iran also brought them together under one alliance. But until recently, this alliance largely remained unofficial because the Gulf countries were continuing their moral support to the Palestinian cause. So the established norm in West Asian geopolitics was that Arab-Israel relations was always defined by the Palestinian issue. But this was permanently changed with the signing of the historic Abraham Accords in 2020, when then US President Donald Trump mediated a settlement between Israel and the Arab countries. And with the approval of Saudi Arabia, UAE became the first Gulf country to recognize Israel and establish official diplomatic relations with the country. Since then, UAE and Israel have gone on to establish very close economic, security, and strategic relations. And this was followed by Bahrain also signing the Abraham Accords, which led Bahrain to recognize Israel and establish diplomatic ties with Israel. Immediately after this, other Arab countries in the North African region, such as Morocco and Sudan, also signed their agreements, which were separate peace agreements with Israel, thus ending their hostilities, and they finally recognized the country formally and established ties with Israel. So this essentially meant the Arab-Israel relationship was no longer defined by the Palestinian issue. The Arab countries, especially the Gulf countries led by Saudi Arabia and UAE, they had long ended their direct backing of the Palestinian movement, and in collusion with the United States, they were already aligned with Israel covertly or secretly. But through the Abraham Accords, this has been made formal, and today these Gulf Arab countries are getting closer to Israel and US with the intention of establishing a stronger security grouping against their common threat, which is Iran. So this is what led Israel to recently host this summit of top officials from these countries. And the US has also proposed a new collective security initiative known as the Middle Eastern Defensive Envelope. Until now, US was the primary security guarantor for all these countries in West Asia against the threats posed by Iran. But of late, the declining American influence and its security presence in the region had led the Gulf countries and Israel to come up with their own initiatives to counter Iran. These countries, they see Iran as a primary threat due to two reasons. One, because of Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, and two, its covert backing of various extremist groups in the region that target American, Saudi, and Israeli interests. As these countries have increasingly targeted the Iranian regime since 1979, Iran felt a desperate need to build and develop nuclear weapons as a deterrent against the threats posed by US, Israel, and the Gulf countries. These countries have made many attempts to topple the Iranian regime, and they have even waged their own covert war and cyber wars against Iran. In retaliation, Iran has responded by not only seeking to develop nuclear weapons as a deterrent, but also by waging its own covert war by backing extremist outfits like Hamas in the Gaza Strip to target Israel. And Iran is also known to back Hezbollah in Lebanon, that is known to target American and Israeli interests. Of late, in Yemen, Iran has triggered a civil war by toppling the Saudi Arabia-backed government by using its proxy, the Houthi rebels. In the last 2 years, the Houthi rebels have stepped up attacks against Saudi Arabia and UAE, and by using armed drones, Houthi rebels have disrupted oil production in Saudi Arabia and UAE through repeated terror attacks. So as the US has been unable to come to their direct help and support against Iran, they are relying on US diplomatic support to stitch an alliance to form a collective security initiative called the Middle Eastern Defensive Envelope, under which they are hoping to make use of Israeli missile defense systems to provide collective security to the Gulf countries against any Iranian threats. Here it is also important to note that the divergence in the approach of US and the Gulf countries, and as well as Israel, when it comes to the question of revisiting the Iran nuclear deal. Today the US is trying to revive the Iran nuclear deal after Donald Trump withdrew US from the deal, and the US is hoping that the deal is the best way to end hostilities with Iran. Because under the terms of the deal, Iran's nuclear program is going to be curbed and restricted in return for US lifting its economic sanctions. So the Biden administration has made it a priority to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal and to lift the sanctions in exchange for Iran accepting curbs on its nuclear weapons program. But Israel and the Gulf countries do not agree with this approach of US, as they fear that the lifting of economic sanctions will further strengthen and embolden Iran's economy, which would eventually lead Iran to develop nuclear weapons and also to strengthen its conventional military capabilities. So these divergences between US, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf countries over the question of Iran nuclear deal has led them to come up with the idea of a collective security initiative called the Middle Eastern Defensive Envelope, and this represents a major paradigm shift in West Asian geopolitics. The editorial points out that forming such alliances is just pragmatic realism, and essentially there is nothing wrong with it. But however, it points out that these countries will have to realize that forming such collective security groupings is only going to increase hostilities and rivalries with Iran. So, if they truly seek security and stability, then the best approach for them would be to work with Iran and achieve some sort of peace, which would be the only lasting solution for stability in West Asia. Now, let's take up another editorial from page number 8, which examines the Prisoners Identification Bill or the Criminal Procedure Identification Bill 2022, which has been recently introduced in the Parliament. Through this bill, the Government of India has proposed to expand the collection of biometric details and biological data and samples from prisoners. See, collecting the basic biological details and biometrics of prisoners, such as photographs, fingerprints, their bodily measurements, etc., have been common practice since the colonial era, which was authorized under a 1922 law. But now the Government of India is seeking to significantly expand this data collection against prisoners through the Criminal Procedure Identification Bill, and it seeks to extract and collect more biometric details and biological samples, and goes much beyond photographs, fingerprints, and body measurements. It proposes to collect deep finger impressions along with palm prints and footprint impressions, and as well as scans of the retina and iris. Apart from such biometric data, it also proposes to collect biological samples of the prisoner, which essentially provides for DNA samples from biological sources such as saliva, blood, semen, etc. It also proposes to capture the behavioral attributes of a prisoner, such as their signatures, their handwriting, etc. Since this bill contains such aggressive and invasive provisions, it has already generated a controversy in the Parliament, and many members have already opposed the bill on the grounds that it violates the right to privacy of the prisoners, which has been guaranteed as a fundamental right under Article 21 in the landmark K.S. Puttaswamy judgment of the Supreme Court. According to critics of the bill, it also violates Article 20, Clause 3, which provides every individual the right against self-incrimination, which essentially provides the right to not provide evidence against oneself. This fundamental right could also be violated as the bill provides for coercive and forced sample collection with no choice being given to the prisoners. Now, these arguments are very important because please note, prisoners don't just involve who have already been convicted of serious offences, but will also include those who are just accused and are undergoing trial. So that being the case, and given the state of India's policing system, there is every possibility that such intimate data could be potentially misused, which would violate not just the right to privacy and the right against self-incrimination of the prisoner, but could also lead to the abuse and targeting of the accused by the authorities, and could also lead to falsification of evidence in vital cases, which would violate the principles of natural justice and rule of law. So there have been serious concerns that have been raised over the manner in which the bill proposes to collect this data, preserve this data, store the data, and there are major concerns about how the data will be disseminated between different institutions and authorities, and as to when the data would be destroyed. According to the bill, it provides for preserving of such data for 75 years, and the data will be destroyed earlier only if the prisoner has been discharged or acquitted. So such invasive provisions of the bill has definitely raised concerns about data privacy and data security. especially at a time when the country is yet to have a strong data protection law in place. The Data Protection Bill is still hanging in the Parliament because of a separate controversy surrounding the bill, and enacting such a prisoner identification bill in the absence of a strong data protection law would leave the data privacy and data security of prisoners vulnerable for exploitation and abuse by the authorities. Along with that, there are some serious differences in the 1922 law and the 2022 bill, because under the previous law, only certain category of convicts were mandated to provide their biometric details. Only those who are being convicted for more than 1 year in prison, only their data was being harvested under the previous law. But the current bill proposes the extraction of biometric details, biological samples of all convicts who have been accused of violating any law, including those who have been arrested and detained under preventive detention laws. So this gives enormous scope for misuse, and the government and the police could potentially misuse these provisions to target dissidents and opponents of the ruling parties. The bill does provide for some exemptions in certain cases, but it is highly unlikely that the convicts would be aware whether they can deny the collection of such intimate personal data, and it largely enables the police to collect such data from all the convicts. So because of these serious concerns surrounding the Criminal Procedure Identification Bill, the editorial recommends that the bill will have to be carefully examined by a standing committee of the Parliament so that a deeper scrutiny can be carried out regarding the concerns of the bill. Next, we have a few small articles that provide us with important updates. According to this article on page number 14, the import of plastic bottles for waste processing is being allowed by the government. Back in 2019, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change had banned the import of plastic waste such as plastic bottles for waste processing in India. These restrictions on plastic waste management is governed under the Plastic Waste Management Rules, but the waste processing industry was of the opinion that this ban on the import of plastic waste was leaving behind very little plastic waste for processing, which in turn was causing significant financial losses to the waste processing industries. See, India happens to be a major destination for plastic waste processing, and every year thousands of tons of plastic waste was being dumped on India from countries such as US, Canada, Germany, etc. And this was seen to be strengthening the waste processing sector in India. But this was leading to a dichotomy where the waste processors would be more interested in importing waste and in recycling the imported waste instead of focusing on the collection of local plastic waste, as this requires the creation of a robust waste collection and waste management system. So waste processors were conveniently importing plastic waste from other countries and processing that in India, whereas lakhs of tons of plastic waste would be lying around in India and adequate attention was not being given to the collection and processing of this local plastic waste, thus turning it into a significant environmental problem. So based on these considerations, the Environment Ministry had banned the import of plastic waste in 2019. But now, under the pressure of the waste processing industry, the government has revoked the ban. And because of the environmental concern that arises out of this policy change, environmental groups have opposed it. Now let's look at another small article from page number 14. According to this article, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium has held its first ever maritime exercise, known as IMEX 22 at Goa in the Arabian Sea. See, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium is a biennial meeting or a naval conference that was founded by India and is hosted by India. Under this initiative, the Indian Navy was bringing together around 25 navies from across the littoral states of the Indian Ocean region to discuss and deliberate upon the key maritime security issues affecting the Indian Ocean region. This year, the Indian Navy is taking this initiative one step ahead and has decided to hold the first ever maritime exercise under the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. Until now, it was just a symposium or a conference where the gathering of different navies from the Indian Ocean would discuss and deliberate upon key security issues of the Indian Ocean. But now this initiative has been given more muscle by the Indian Navy by organizing its first maritime exercise. And 16 out of the 25 members have participated in the maritime exercise with special focus on disaster management and HADR operations or humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations in the interest of strengthening regional maritime security cooperation. This initiative of the Indian Navy fits in line with the Sagar doctrine of the Modi government. Then coming to the last topic, we shall take a look at the small article from page number 1. The article deals with the BIMSTEC summit that was hosted by Sri Lanka yesterday, and we had even covered this topic in detail in our yesterday's analysis. But an important point to note from this article is that Prime Minister Modi addressed the BIMSTEC summit in the virtual format, and he praised the grouping for adopting the BIMSTEC Charter, which has laid down the objectives and priorities of the grouping. Along with adopting the BIMSTEC Charter, Prime Minister Modi has proposed the idea of a free trade agreement for the BIMSTEC members in order to promote the free movement of goods, services and investments amongst the littoral states of the Bay of Bengal. This proposal fits in line with the master plan for transport connectivity that has been agreed upon the BIMSTEC members to boost regional connectivity. With improved connectivity, if there is an FTA amongst the members, it will give a significant boost to the free movement of goods, services, investments, and as well as people amongst the member states. Now let's take a look at the mains practice questions. The first question: India's journey from chronic food shortage to surplus producer and partnering with the World Food Programme has lessons for the developing world. Comment. The second question: the signing of Abraham Accords has led to shifting of the geopolitical fulcrum in West Asia. Examine. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So as we bring this session to an end, I would like to remind you to like the video, to share the video with fellow aspirants, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.